This is the true history of the pirate Farley, with a factual account of the disappearance of his cat-rigged boat. Part 3.
The following day I abandoned my work and went down to the boatyard. I knew I was shirking my duties, but what could I do? In a hut just beside the lagoon, he was caulking the hull of a skiff. Farley saw me. He stopped and he bid me sit down with him there by the boat, and I did. And I hemmed and I hawed for a while, and he saw I was nervous, so kindly he offered me tea. When he brought it, we sat for a while just in silence. I didn't know how to begin. In the sky there were clouds scudding by. I watched them and tried to form words. Nothing came. Well, his patience was finally spent. "Spit it out. What's the matter? Don't mope like a dope. Spit it out." For a moment I groped for the words. Then they came. "I've seen flowers the same as the ones you and Leah have there on your wrists. At least I think they're the same. I was wondering if you'd let me look at it close-like." He stiffened, his mood all suspicious. "And why do you care?" In his eye was a warning. But I was committed now, so I pressed on. "Well, this island, the others, the cats, I don't know, but I think that the alkylus, that's where it comes from. The power all comes from those flowers somehow. See, I picked some and felt it. And then, well, a friend told me." "What? That the islanders here were once cats? It's their lore. It's a myth." He was clearly upset. "Superstition," he said, "and I wish they would leave it alone. Leave my Leah alone." He stood up and took 2 steps away, his fists clenched and unclenched as he fought for control. From the bench I could not see his face, but I stayed in my place and I waited. I knew he would speak if he wanted. "They say they see cats in these blasted tattoos. Say the number of cats is a sign telling you. Well, it's foolish, absurd." Then he turned, and his words were so angry I shrank from him. "See for yourself." And he came to me, lifting his sleeve. "I see naught but a vine with some flowers. They tell me I ought to see cats there. Do you? Am I mad? Tell the truth. Are there cats there?" His voice was constricted. His glare was intense. I was almost afraid to look down at his hand. But I did. And I saw. Through the brown of his sun-leathered skin, I could see all the thin twining lines that encircled his fingers and wrist. And the flowers were there, little buds nestled tight in the curves of the vine. But that wasn't quite right. Those wee flowers were fashioned. Oh, I must have turned ashen. I looked, and good Farley was in such a passion I knew I could never reveal what I saw. It was like a gestalt, for the flowers were drawn in a way so that they would depict just the spray of fine blossoms. But then, of a sudden, well, cats. Most were curled up and napping. A few were attacking their friends. Oh, and one toward the thumb curled back to bite down on his own little tail. They were shown with a lifelike detail that was eldritch. And then it flipped. They were flowers again, just like that. As though something within the fine lines of that tat could control what you saw, slightly shifting the drawing, concealing the cats neath the flowers and vines. I looked up. He could see that I'd seen, and I tried to deny it, but what could I say? When I lied, he just laughed, and the pain in his eyes was so plain that I couldn't continue. He turned from me then. "I am busy. Be gone." He went back to his work. Well, I sat there and watched him. I felt like a jerk. No, 'twas more. I could sense there was some deep offense, Just by seeing what he couldn't see, through no fault of my own, I had widened that gap in our friendship. I can't quite explain. So I left, in the end, without saying a word. And it seems so absurd now, but months went by, months, before Farley and I saw each other again. It was just too, well, awkward. He worked on his boats, and I spent my time stalking the Isle. I was tending the trails, but while wending my way, while I worked, I was all the time looking for gentle Charette. I had so many questions, and she was the only one ever expressed she was willing to talk. Other islanders balked when I asked. I was just an outsider to them. But I finally lost faith I could find her. So slowly I turned my thoughts back to my friend. I had known him so long, from a whelp. He had saved me and helped me to find a profession. I couldn't just let him stay angry with me. I decided I needed to talk to him. So one afternoon I proceeded to Leah and Farley's fair home. It was far from where I had been working, and so it was almost the evening when finally I came to their door. They invited me in, and we sat. But before I could tell them my reason for coming and plea for good Farley's forgiveness, Charette arrived. From outside, we could hear a soft voice gently singing. We rose and went out. My ears were just ringing. Coincidence can't work such magic. Enchanted and breathless, I knew it was her. I had sought her in vain, but the fates had arranged us to meet. Now she came up the path carrying "We on," and she greeted us all with her smile, so fair and beguiling. In her presence I felt I had entered a dream. She had come because Leah was large with a child. This was just before Farley and I were exiled. And I have to believe that Charette could perceive the disaster that Chamounix's awful deceit would bring down on us. Offering help then, she came more for Farley than Leah. She knew that the blame for the imminent loss would be his, though the cost even she was unable to gauge at the time. Well, their meeting was awkward. Leah thanked her, and Farley invited her in. She declined, saying stars were already appearing. Her baby was weary, and she should be taking her home before dark. The crepuscular stars were indeed in the sky, and so Leah, in innocence, asked whether I would be willing to go with Charette, even though Charette's baby was just then beginning to cry. Well, of course I accepted. I tried not to show just how eager I was, but I felt, well, aglow. And my nervousness made me all dumb. I'm afraid I just stood there, unsure what to do, what to say. Then I offered to carry her baby, and she unexpectedly handed the child straight to me. Oh, it was light as a fairy. That baby, I swear she was nothing but breath in the shape of a child. In the instant I lifted her up, she left off her complaining, and I was lost in her soft, gentle eyes. I had never before then endeavored to comfort an infant, and dumbly I stared. When I lifted my eyes, there were smiles on the faces around me. In Farley and Leah's were traces of laughter, but there in Charette's eyes, her fair hazel eyes, I saw kindness and beauty Iroon. At my feet, Charette's cat gave a yowl. It was time. We departed. We walked through an evening sublime. I had never before known contentment. No, more, I'd believed that contentment like love was a lie. But my cynical views of the world fell away on that night, with that child in my arms. On was Fay, and her mother, Charette. I will never regret what we shared on that night, as we followed her cat down that scintillant, canopied trail. I could feel the world turning beneath us. It all felt unreal. My senses were more than on fire, and the core of my being was changed. With that child and Charette, 'neath that boundless and star-blasted sky, I was changed. There are things in our lives that were not meant for tales. There are things that are private. A person who fails to recognize this is a fool who will whisper away all the sacred and magical things of this world. So I'll keep to myself what occurred on that night, what was said as we talked until dawn's blushing light filled the sky. It's a memory I would condemn myself dreadfully were I to tell and corrupt it. In the few days that followed, Charette and I met many times, and we shared many things, and I let myself think it could last. But that's all in the past. I'll not dwell on this difficult part of the tale. I heard hissing and scratching one dark rainy night, so I opened the door and I held out a light. It was Recluse, Charette's cat. He looked to be drowned, but he shook himself off and turned round to face into the dark. Soon Charette appeared out of the black. I could see by her face there was something amiss. "I will need you to see to the child for the night," she said, wild with some grief. "Leah's having her baby. It's time." A foreboding unsettled me. I couldn't speak. As I took Charette's child, my hands shook. I felt weak. And they left, both the cat and Charette, and I sat there with awe and without knowing why. Well, I wept. The rain eased in the night, but at dawn it returned with a vengeance. I longed to go out and to learn what had happened, but waking the child and then taking her out in the storm, well, I couldn't, and so I just waited. At noon, a boy messenger came with the terrible news. He could not speak her name. He was almost insane in his grief. He explained through his choking and sobbing how valiantly Leah had struggled. All night she had worked through her pain without any complaint, but the baby was plainly not turned as it ought to have been. It was caught, and there seemed to be nothing that Leah could do. Toward the end of the night, she'd gone into a trance. Her attendants could see that there wasn't much chance for the baby. But Leah was strong. With no heed to the pain, she bore down, and the baby was finally born. Well, the baby was hale and hearty. But Leah had died. Her attendants had struggled for hours. They had tried to revive her, but fate had her way. Leah's date had arrived, as foretold by the other's tattoo. It was many years later when Farley explained that by reading the tats one could there ascertain, in the flowers and vines, in their tendrils and twinings, the time one had left 'neath the sun and the stars. I was stunned, and yet somehow I wasn't surprised. When I heard Leah's dead, I at once realized that a part of me knew this would happen. That beautiful Leah had chosen this path years before, when some strangers had landed their ship on her shore, and their captain had stolen her heart. Then the floor came to meet me, a light like a starburst, and then night. I was floating in darkness, and then there was motion below me. A vast and horizonless ocean was pitching and churning and yearning. The notion occurred to consume me. I fell. And then I saw Leah, dead, on a bier at the side of a cliff. and beside her, quite near, circling round, was a cat, indistinct, not too clear for the cat. It was made of a dream. But the cat became solid, and Leah, she faded. A mist was between them. It twisted and braided as Leah turned into a dream. They had traded themselves. And then Leah was gone. I felt strangely contented as slowly I turned to see Farley, but old, very old. I discerned he was dead, but then, no, he was sleeping. I burned to awaken him. Farley? So old? Then a cat came and curled in his lap, and the sound of its purring enveloped me. Oh, it surrounded me, bathed me, and then I knew peace. In a moment, however, the feeling was gone. I was falling again, falling fast, on and on to the waves, which were thrashing and angry. It dawned on me then I was dying. I screamed. When I opened my eyes, I could see Charette's child in the arms of the messenger boy. He just smiled, but On screamed, and she flailed as I struggled and failed to get up off the floor. On my head it was spinning. I finally got to the bench, and the messenger roughly thrust On in my arms. Dispossessed of the baby, he fled, though I shouted and pled for more news. He ignored me and flew from that place. I was left once again just to wait. Well, On screamed. The rain fell. It was like I was still in the dream, plunging helplessly down to the waves, where I'd drown, never knowing the reason, the meaning, the sense of it all. After hours of waiting, some men came and burst through the door. They demanded the child. Now at first I objected, but when they drew weapons, well then I was sure that my nightmare was coming to life. When they took Charette's child, they left sentries to guard me. To guard me? But what had I done? I could hardly contain myself. Why were they keeping me? Why had they taken the child? This is madness, I cried. The deluge continued outside, as gray day became night. For my dinner they brought me a tray of hard figs with some bread. And then one of them said I should ready myself. What he meant I knew not, but it didn't take long to discover. An hour had gone by, and the deluge had slackened to showers when they came. Though I fought, it was futile. They brought me outside and then thrust me up into a wagon. From their treatment, I thought they were going to kill me. The wagon jerked forward. I fell, and a chill went right through me as hands stopped my fall. A commanding and strangely familiar voice asked for my name. Oh, it was Farley. He too was a prisoner. Relieved, I embraced him and told him my name. He just heaved me aside and ignored me. Although I implored him to share what he knew, he was silent and brooding. We rattled along through the night as the rain made its way through our clothes. We descended through cane fields and came to the coast, where we met a great host of armed men. There were horses and torches, and there was the king. He appeared to be troubled. He wouldn't look over at us. We turned north. I just couldn't make sense of it. Farley sat silent. I hardly could make out his form in the ominous gloom. At the northernmost tip of the island, we came to a halt. I was frightened. In silence, the flames from the torches snaked down to the shore. Grimly frowning, my friend turned and said, "This is it. Here we go." "Are they going to kill us?" I asked. Farley smiled. "That would be a relief. No, my friend. We're exiled." and the rest is quite frankly a blur. We were yanked from our seats and forced down to a dock. Someone read off the charges against us, but I couldn't hear what was said. I was dazed, and the leering and jeering of men all around drowned the sound of the reader. So when we were asked if we had a defense, we stood silent, as surf pounded stone into sand. Then the king, stepping up, gave some quiet command, and both Farley and me were shoved into the sea. We swam out to a dinghy that pitched on the waves. Well, we floated there, watching the torches on shore file away to the south, as the menfolk who bore them went back to their lives, to their houses and wives. There was one torch, however, that lingered. In the darkness we couldn't make out who it was, but whoever it was a friend there, because though it rained, they remained there until their torch guttered and died. There is no way to know, but I let myself think that our witness that night was Charette. Well, there's not much to tell now. We rode on that swell till the sun lit the clouds, then well, it was hell. We just rode and we rode till our backs were all bowed and the clouds darkened down. It was nighttime again. It was during that first day that Farley came round. He fought back his despair and took heart from a newfound desire to see his new child. He and Leah had made in their love a wee girl. He had held her but once, in the moments before he'd been taken away. With great tears in his eyes, he had shaken his coat out and wrapped it around her. She grappled and struggled and cried out at first, but he lifted her up, held her close to his chest, and she quieted. Only a moment he held her there, sighing, and learning by heart all her features and parts. In that moment she captured him whole. Well, he vowed he would see her again. We were 8 days at sea, and we lived because Farley, he never gave in to despair. I could see he was hurting whenever I looked, but he never stopped working. He wouldn't give up. He would hold her again. He built us a sail, lashed an oar to a rail by the thwart, and then sewed up our shirts, and I bailed. Farley made me. He forced me to help steer a course. He would not let me rest. He had vowed he would see her again. I was frankly depressed. I despaired. See, I guessed we would die there at sea, so why try? In the west there was blood in the sky every evening, and I felt myself bleeding too. How my heart ached and ached for Charette. In the night time, good Farley, while sailing by starlight, collected the dew in a tarp. He was smart. He caught fish on a nail that he took from the bailing pail. He had a daughter to live for. He'd find her, he swore. On the 6th day, a storm overtook us. No normal storm, that. It was something malign. There were forms in the clouds. There were faces and figures that chased back and forth, as though gods were at war there above us. I was sure we would drown. Farley battened things down, but the seas were too large. They were pitching and pounding us mercilessly. I saw death in the tea-colored waves, and I welcomed it. Death. I was ready. But death didn't come. We continued to lumber through uncertain seas. We were both of us numb from the cold. Lack of sleep made us dumb. In a heap in the bow of the boat, I just lay there and waited. But death didn't come. I grew angry. I grumbled and cursed. But good Farley was steady. He humbly kept watch at the tiller. Through sheer force of will, he was able to keep us on course and alive. I was so far past care, when he shouted, I stared at him dumbly. There's land? What is land? Over there, he was pointing. A line in the darkness, so fine, but a line all the same, and so blessedly still. Sudden hope. And it grew as we sailed straight into the colorless dawn. It was land. It was true. Well, we shouted and swore, and although we were sore, we began to get ready to try to make land. But it wasn't to be. The storm grew, and the sea began pitching us violently this way and that. We could just see the surf, and behind it the turf of a field. Were those cows? And then something exploded. Water closed all around. There was crashing, then sound disappeared as the waves washed me over and down. We had run down the face of a wave. We had raced into razor-sharp rocks, and our boat came apart. I was gasping and thrashing through waves that were crashing and foaming around. Then I thought in a flash of some lightning I saw my friend Farley. He fought with a tangle of kelp that was dragging him down. But I couldn't stay near to him. Weak now and weary, the waves washed me in toward the beach. I could hear the dull roar of the surf on the shore, and I knew that I hadn't the strength to withstand such a pounding. I was rolled, I was tossed. I was sure I was lost when the waves swept me sideways. They tangled and crossed one another. They curled and foamed in a swirl midst the wind and confusion and crashing. I sank. But I sank onto sand. What was this? There were hands all around me. A blanket. I lay on the strand. There was running and shouting and something about how the other one couldn't be seen anymore. I was held to the ground. Though I shouted, no sound came. I struggled to sit, just to sit, but I found myself simply too weak. I could not even speak. Then the dark came to claim me again. I was gone. There is nothing to say of the following days. I recovered and then took my leave. Made my way far away from the coast. I was haunted. The ghost of my friend wrapped in seaweed and kelp was too much. I lived inland, to be far away from the sea. There was nothing I wanted, no life left for me. I just wandered. I couldn't stay still, and I wouldn't go near any coast. I was numb. I was lost. How I lived through those years, I don't know. It was queer. There was something peculiar inside me that clearly would not let me die. Despite everything, I kept on going. Through poverty, sickness, exposure. The world wore away at me. Day after day there was less of me. I didn't care. Life was gray. So I wandered until by some chance, without willing it, somehow I came to a hill that looked out on the sea. There it was, the sea. And I stopped and stood in shocked silence, because when I was young, the sea had meant hope, adventure, the promise of an exciting and fulfilling life. But now, as I looked out, all I saw was a vast emptiness and loss. And I realized that the sea had not changed. I had changed. And that loss, that entire ocean of loss, was within me. I was struck with a madness. I'd end all my sadness for once and for all. I'd go straight to the sea. I walked down from the hill. I intended to kill myself, sure that my life was a waste. And my will was profound. I intended to drown myself, back to the sea. Quickly now through the town I proceeded, past homes and past shops, past a couple of cops in their car who suspiciously turned when I stopped for a rest. I could see they were eager for me to be gone. So was I. So I lifted my bones, and I headed straight down to the docks, which I found were abandoned. No people, no boats, just the sound of complaining old seagulls. They sounded to me almost mournful. They grieved for the coming of night, not for me. And the sun was transforming the skyline, adorning the clouds with bold crimsons and golds, giving form to their formlessness. And I knew I would never see blue in the sky any more. So I paused before leaping. And I thought I was done. But just then, as the sun formed a pupilless eye between sea and the sky, I heard something behind me. I turned. In my mind, I can still see him there on the dock. It was Farley. He slowed to a stop, and his jaw, it dropped open. We stared, each one seeing a ghost. We'd lost hope that the other'd survived. But the fates had contrived to surprise us again. It was him. It was Farley. Unexpectedly then he rushed forward, and when he had gathered me up in his arms, I gave vent to my pent-up emotions. I wept, a whole ocean of tears. And good Farley, he cried just as much. Both in shock, we sat down with our backs to the town and looked out at the sea. "I was sure you were drowned," I said, after a long and awkward silence. "You were wrong," he said, bitterly laughing and clapping my shoulder. He told me how he'd been caught up in the seaweed and thought himself lost, but then fate interceded. The tangle of wrack washed him out, and then back to the rocks where we'd crashed. Breaking free in one last desperate effort, he kicked for the rocks. He was quick, but the waves were all chaos and foam, and a rick in his shoulder was causing him pain. By the laws of the ocean he ought to have drowned, but he wasn't intended to meet Davy Jones. In a feat that was nothing but luck, as he told me, he cheated the fishes again. He was sinking, but then a rogue wave came and lifted him up, crashed him onto the rocks where he clung for his life. He'd been flung up so high he was free from the surge, so he hung on, reserving his strength for a while. But at length he crawled up, just as high as he could. Then he fainted. The following day a stray fishing boat, making its way up the coast, chanced to see him there, laying amongst several seals. He awoke to the peals of laughter as sailors who thought they'd recovered a corpse found him snoring instead. Well, they bore him up coast to a town where they set him ashore. Now, it took him a day to recover. He may have caught up with me but for that one day's delay. He came back to the site of our wreck just a night after I had departed. He learned with delight I'd survived, and he sought to pursue me. He thought he would find me in some coastal town. After all, we were men of the sea. But I wanted to be, as I've said, far away from the shore. And so he never found me. For weeks he went searching, but seeking me there by the sea, well, our paths never crossed. After looking for me, he went back to the sea. With no money, no ship of his own, he agreed to be cook on an ugly old boat with a smug and incompetent crew. Not a one of them recognized Farley, the fools. Well, he sailed with them 14 long months, but they finally put him ashore. They were all nearly starved from his cooking. He'd charred every bit of their food to a cinder. Nigh half of the crew had lost teeth, and they all had lost weight. Good old Farley. See, he didn't care what they ate. He just wanted to look for that island. A cook? He could cook about as well as a blindfolded chimp. But for 14 long months he gazed out at the sea from the deck of that ship. Not a sign did he see, not so much as an island-shaped cloud. Just long mile after mile of that distant, indifferent horizon. Well, that crew got so mad at their poisonous cook that one day, In a far distant harbor, they took him and threw him right overboard, him and his stove. Then they cursed him and sailed off without looking back. Now you'd think he'd be lost with no money, no boat. But that man had more grit than an old billy goat. So he swam to the shore where he cursed and he swore for a bit. Then he went into town to continue his search. He contrived to get work at a store in that port that sold charts. For 2 months he just pored over maps of the oceans. He harbored a notion that some ancient map might contain just a clue. And when sailors came into the store, he would corner the older ones, press them with questions, the foreigners especially. But naught did he learn. Overwrought, he eventually bought a small boat and set sail. He'd no notion about where the isle lay, he'd no plan, but he couldn't stay still. So he set out and ran across the ocean, first west, but then on without rest he turned south, circled back, crossed again, and veered north this time, searching the moving horizon for her. Again and again he set out, undeterred and spurred on by his grief. But he found no relief, and he wore himself out all alone in that boat on that wide-open, sun-wasted sea. Well, he couldn't remember exactly what happened. He wouldn't say where he was found, but a slow-sailing, homebound old dogger discovered him, sunburnt and starved and delirious. Taking him on, they saved him. They brought him ashore, and in kindness they gave him some money, some clothes, and some food. I've heard those with the least tend to share theirs the most. Those poor fishermen didn't know Farley from Adam, but from their small store they provisioned him. Salts of the rum-soaked old earth, folks like that. So, though thin as an orphaned cat, Farley at least had some clothes for his bones. Well, he wandered a while, till he came to the dockside's abandoned old houses and shops. As the locks were all rusted, he looked through them all and soon took to a run-down hotel, where some cats were then living. When he'd finished, I told him my story, withholding the last, how I'd come there that day. He consoled me, and I consoled him, and we laughed at the whim of the fates who had kept us apart for so long. Our reunion had saved me. For Farley, he gave me a room in his house. It had been a close shave, but with Farley I healed. And I never revealed just how close I had come to that ultimate folly. Farley's house was infested with cats. As a guest, I was loath to complain, but good Lord, they were pests. And it seemed every day a new stray made its way to that house, and good Farley, he took them all in. For a while I could take it, but when I would wake with a cat on my head, or I'd step in a lake of their pee, well, I had to complain. I felt bad, but I just couldn't stay. So a month or two after I'd come, I moved out. Just next door was about the most ugly, abandoned old house. Farley doubted its worth, but I ripped off the plywood and slipped through the door. Then I found that the place was all right. So I lived there. I live there. Still do. And I give Farley's place a wide berth, 'cause it's still all a-quiver with cats. Well, I should tell you, at first I thought Farley was cursed by those cats. They were everywhere, suddenly bursting from cupboards or chasing in pairs down the stairs. I was tripped more than once by those cats underfoot. Farley loved them, I knew that, but equally true was the fact that these cats were, feral. Not mewing and purring and cuddling cats. These drew blood if you happened to walk within reach of their claws. And it wasn't just me. Farley, too, wasn't free from attack. There were times when his legs would be bleeding. I'd ask him again why he didn't just send them away. He'd just smile. "I am waiting," he'd say. Well, as time passed, I found that the cats hanging round went through cycles. Some months I just wanted to drown them or boil them to tallow. But then in the following year, several mean ones would leave and a gentle new cat would arrive. Farley always contrived to make room for the new ones. They seemed to revive him. He clearly was looking for something. He took each new cat as a clue. He was waiting for some sort of message. It never arrived. And whenever a new cat proved just to be that, just a cat, Farley fell a bit further. He'd weep, but then, churlish and angry, he'd keep to himself more and more. Over time, he withdrew. He stopped caring for new cats. They came and they went without notice. I knew he was changing, but what could I do? He kept shutting me out. He'd no hope any more, only pain. I decided one night that I needed to fight for him. I had despaired, and I knew that he might, if his pain was too great, if my counsel came late, he might take his own life, as I almost had done. I confronted him down by the docks. He had found that old catboat, that wreck of a thing run aground years before, and now rotting on shore. It was not much to look at, but he liked to go there and sit. Well, I climbed up the side of his boat and confided to him all my fears and concerns, and I tried to be gentle and kind. And he heard. I reminded him how in the past he'd been strong, been a leader. He'd always been vigorous, joyful. His signature cry was, "Get on with the game." When the rigging was fouled in a storm, it was Farley who normally climbed through the wind and the rain with a smile and a song. He'd been known as a man who had shown through his actions that life was for laughing, not groaning and moaning and sadness. I told him he had to take heart and shake off this despair. Well, he sat there a while, on his face the sad smile of a parent, about to impart to his child some advice which, while true, was the kind that withdrew from the world some small part of the wonder of childhood. He said, "I never had a mother. Father left before I knew his name. I raised myself. I begged and stole and kept myself alive, and that was all I was, alive. I had no joy or happiness. I was merely alive. And then one day I found myself beneath an open window. A boy inside had in his hand a ship, a little toy with sails and rigging. Lovely little thing. The boy, with rounded cheeks, was blowing up a storm. The ship was pitching violently. The boy was shouting, telling his crew what to do. But then a door behind the boy was opened. Quickly he tried to hide the toy, but he wasn't fast enough. His mother sat beside him there, and he looked down, all teary, full of shame. He didn't see his mother's smile. She wasn't angry at all. She asked him how he'd retrieved the ship from off the mantel. Hearing her tone, the boy looked up, and quickly his guilt became enthusiasm. Gleefully he told how he'd placed the chair beside the desk and climbed to steal it down. His mother feigned at shock and horror. Then they laughed together. Laughed and held each other. Held each other, until the laughter fell away and they lapsed into a mutual silence. Now I had known a great variety of silences, but never had I felt that comfort. Ease. They finally spoke. The boy, it seems, was missing his father who'd gone to sea. His mother said she missed him too. She asked the boy if he would go to sea when he grew up, and by her tone the two of them had said this script 1,000 times before. "Oh yes," he said, "I'll be a pirate." "Pirate?" "Yes, but good. I'll steal from other pirates, take their gold and take it back to who they stole it from." "They'll be so thankful." "Yes, they'll have a parade and make me mayor, but I won't do it, 'cause I'll have a ship. I'll go back out to sea, exploring places no one's ever been. I'll sail away and—" Well, the boy went on and on. His mother listened eagerly, and so did I. The dream of that boy became my own. I heard a tale, a childish tale, and longed to live it. Foolish, but I was just a boy myself. At length the boy came to the end of his dream. Suddenly self-conscious, he forced a laugh and said, "It's just a dream, a silly dream." His mother gently held his chin and turned his head to look him in the eye. "There's nothing silly in dreams. Your dreams are real, you know. It's just that dreams have yet to come to pass. They happen here." She touched his head. "Before they happen here." She gestured out the window. I ducked down. "And if you're strong like Papa, you can make your dreams come true. The world is just a place for building dreams. The trick to growing up is not to let the world shape you, but keep your dreams alive. They're like a plan. Your life is when you take that plan and build the world around it." I heard those words. I overheard those words and took them, though they were not meant for me. I heard those words and took them straight to heart. I lived them. I went straight down to the docks. I signed aboard a ship. For years and years. I worked and learned and fought, and through it all I heard that woman's voice. "Your dreams are like a plan. Your life is when you take that plan and build the world around it." Well, I built myself a life that, like my dreams, was full and wild and wondrous. Still, I knew I wanted more. I'd never known a time when I could rest, a time of quiet calm, contentment, love. I'd never known it, love. I'd craved it with all my being. Then we came to that island. It's hard for me to speak her name. My Leah. Dreams and the world were one when Leah came to me. I finally knew fulfillment, love, and then she was taken from me. But still I believed that somehow I could build my dream back into the world. Somehow my Leah could come to me again. For years I sought her out. I waited, watched, I yearned, for years, in vain. In vain. And now I see how foolish I was to shape my life round words intended for a child. Our dreams are only dreams. They cannot shape the world. Most children learn this as they grow, but I, because I borrowed dreams from... Who? I never knew the child's name. I heard his dreams and tried to live them out. I heeded his mother's advice because I hadn't any mother of my own. I have lived my life like a child, believing I could make my dreams come true, but I was wrong. For life is hard, and love will end in loss. Our only hope is that our dreams may come again in death. He then asked me to leave. And I started to grieve, for the Farley I'd known, he was gone. To bereave someone living is awful, and though I still saw him, it wasn't the same. I was sad beyond words. He was clearly depressed, and I have to confess I avoided him. Sometimes I'd see him, still dressed in his night clothes like some kind of crazy man come down to fish for his cats. Well, that's what he'd become. Had she come a year earlier, Farley would surely have recognized her. But the years had inured him to hope. He no longer was looking. His throng of wild cats was just that. They were cats, nothing more. He had looked for so long. For so long he'd been wrong when he thought that he recognized her in that throng of insufferable cats. He'd lost faith. I think that's why he missed her at first when his little bit came. But she recognized him, and she worked her way into his life. Going down to his boat, she would simply climb into his lap, curl up for a nap and be with him. Just with him. And that was enough. He took pleasure in her, but I've never been sure whether Farley knew just who she was. He'd endured disappointment for years, and I think that his tears had by then washed away all his hopes and his dreams. Which is why it is true that brave Littlebit's crew went unnoticed by Farley. He hadn't a clue that this cat was preparing to save him. From where she assembled her crew, I don't know. Perhaps magic. I often have wondered just how it was done, how they came to be there in that boat when the thunder and lightning and rain had chased all of the sane people up and away from the docks. Perhaps magic. Perhaps magic was how that fierce storm came to be in the first place. It wasn't predicted, but suddenly, just before sunset, when night hadn't yet crept up over the eastern horizon, the winds brought the clouds. A whole bank of them, bulwarked up there in the skies to the west, rushing landward. The air was all staticky, tense and foreboding. Immense shocks of heat lightning boiled through the oncoming clouds. Well, now listen. This last is the point. From the west came a wave like a demon that grew till its crest, which was foaming, was higher than masts. It came flying straight into the harbor like something malign. Past the breakwater rocks, past the boats at the docks, that rogue wave had a purpose for Farley. It knocked down the customs house, smashed through the seawall, then crashed up the slope to that catboat where Farley, in shock, thought the end was at hand. I should say, to be candid, I thought the same thing. At the time, I was standing uphill from the boat, for you see, I had noticed the lights in his house were all out, so I'd come down to fetch him in out of the storm. Well, I shouted in terror. I saw that the wave was about to crash down onto Farley's old boat, and I started to run, though I knew it was useless. But then, as I watched from the hill, that wave changed. With a will of its own, it grew gentle, advancing until it just eased its way under that boat. It was wonderful. Slowly, that boat lifted up and was carried away. Through the break in the seawall, it snaked its way out to the harbor. I hurried to make my way down, but I couldn't get through, so I stood there behind all that storm rack and helplessly watched. It was dark, but when lightning flashed, then I caught sight of the boat and brave Farley in silhouette fighting to gain some control. Without sails, it was rolling and pitching so wildly, it soon would go down. Through the wind-driven rain and the darkness, I strained to make out what was happening. Farley was plainly in trouble. He fought with the lines, and I thought he had managed to hook on a sail, but he stopped. He just stopped, and he stood. In the next flash, I couldn't quite see what he held, but around him, I wouldn't believe it if I hadn't seen it, but plying the ropes, pulling cranks, lifting canvas, were cats. They were everywhere, crawling all over and hauling away at the halyards and sheets. To forestall the thing capsizing, 4 of them bore that boat into the wind as the sail, flapping wild, climbed the mast. I was dumb with amazement. I stood in a daze as the scene collapsed back into darkness again. Was I crazy? Or dreaming? A boat that was teeming with cats for a crew? It just couldn't be true. Then the night ripped in two as a lightning bolt flew from the heavens and struck the boat's mast with a lewd sort of crack. I was sure that the boat couldn't endure such a strike. Although blinded, I squinted to see. I expected the mast to be gone, to be blasted to pieces, the ship quickly sinking. The last thing I thought I would see, out beyond the far quay, was a well-ordered ship fully crewed with, well, sailors. But the next strobe-like flash showed just that. A ship dashing straight out of the harbor, and working her, lashing down lines, reefing sails to endure that wild gale, were not cats. They were men. Men and women, I'm sure. They made their way with such speed that my view was impeded when lightning revealed them again. But indeed, once again, I saw people, not cats. Oh, I was weeping, but clearly I saw them. Somehow they were people. Only once more I saw them. They'd tacked and were clawing their way past the headlands out into that maw of indifference, the wide open sea. At the side of the ship was my friend and companion, good Farley. His hand was raised high in farewell, and he cried out some words that were lost in the tempest. Beside him, her arm round his waist, was a girl. She embraced him with fervor, her face in the folds of his jacket. It had been left on the isle. In our long years of exile, I'd not seen that coat. He had left it. Oh, I smiled as I stood on the shore. Though I saw them no more, I'm convinced it was her, Farley's daughter. She'd taken him home. And that's all. Now you know the whole tale. I kept watch through the gale, but with dawn came no sight of the ship or its sail. It was gone. My friend Farley was gone. I could hardly believe it. It seemed like a dream. It still does. But, one final request. You may think that I'm jesting. I've told you I'm not fond of cats. I detest them, in fact. But I kindly would ask, if you find one that's limping, I'd ask you to please let me know.
That was the third and final part of the true history of the pirate Farley, with a factual account of the disappearance of his cat-rigged boat. It was written and voiced and edited and mixed together by me, Dawson Nichols. It was recorded at my friend Jim Horn's house. Thank you, Jim. It is copyright 2020. All rights are, of course, reserved. I hope you liked it. And I hope that if you did, you'll tell your friends about it. I think that's about it. Thanks for listening.